Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, they ask you about wine and gambling. Wine and gambling. Say, in them is great sin and yet some benefit for people. But their sin is greater than their benefit. And they ask you what they should spend. Say, the excess, meaning beyond the basic needs. Thus Allah makes clear to you the verses that you might give thought, that you may reflect. So this verse comes in the series of beginning with they ask you concerning. So we've had previous verses beginning like that, yas'alunaka. They ask you, meaning the companions or whoever is asking the Prophet ﷺ regarding a matter of the deen, and the Prophet ﷺ waits for revelation and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala answers. So this verse is dealing with mainly a couple of topics. Main are two topics. The first one is what is the ruling on, or what is the nature of wine and gambling? What is the reality of wine and gambling? Secondly, what is it we should spend? How much should we spend in charity? What is it, or how much should we spend in charity? This has come before as well. But the main topic we'll discuss is about wine and gambling and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about this. Imam Ahmad and Abu Dawood and Tirmidhi and Nasa'i report that it was Umar ibn al-Khattab who pressed for a ruling on wine. He pressed for a ruling on wine when he first prayed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that a clear commandment be sent regarding wine. And then this verse was revealed. This is one of the narrations mentioned in several hadith collections. As you know, wine and gambling, it was widespread. Obviously, even in this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hasn't made it haram yet. Wine was not made haram straight away with the advent of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It was made haram many years later into the prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In Mecca, it was not made haram. It was a few years in Medina when it was made haram. So what is khamar? What is maisir? Khamar comes from a word which means to cover. In Arabic, it's related to a word which means to cover something or to cloud over something. Like khimar is a head covering. Technically, obviously, it refers to what we know today as wine. In those days, amongst the Arabs, they had different types of wine, some from grape juice, some made from dates, and other similar kind of things from raisins. These were the key types of wine that were being addressed here. When they said wine, khamar, they referred to these type of things. What we know today as wine is very similar. Wine is made usually from either, they used to also make it from barley, or similar things like that. So even today, it's made from similar things. But we'll talk about the category later. What else does it include? Umar radiallahu anh himself, he said, khamar is anything that intoxicates, not just if it's made from grape juice, or raisin juice, or date juice. He said, khamar is defined as anything that intoxicates. Anything that intoxicates. Both small and large quantities of anything that intoxicates is prohibited according to according to the vast, overwhelming majority of scholars in the Tafsir of Qurtubi, Ibn Kathir and others. According to the overwhelming, vast majority of scholars, anything that intoxicates anything that intoxicates is haram in small or large quantities. Meaning, something may not be exactly made from grape juice. It may not be made from raisin juice. It may not be made from date juice. You may not even call it wine, but it's an intoxicant, a drink that intoxicates. It has the same effect. that drink, according to the vast, overwhelming majority of scholars, is haram in small quantities, even if you had a sip, but you didn't get drunk, it didn't intoxicate you. It's haram in small quantities and it's haram in large quantities. Yeah? In terms of maysir, the second word, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الْخَمْرِ وَالْمَيْسِرِ. The second word, maysir, what is that? It comes from a word which refers to something being easy or ease, yusr, right? It's related with gambling. Why? Because acquiring wealth or assets through gambling is seen as an easy thing. You don't have to work for it. It's easy. Obviously, most people lose money, they don't gain, but this could be the connection to the word. But maysir is referring here to gambling. Referring here to gambling. We have to understand when these verses were revealed, what was the condition of the Arab society at that time? What was the condition? Even before Islam, what was the condition of the pre-Islamic Arab society? Gambling and drinking was widespread. It was deeply rooted into their culture, into their pastime, into their habit. Wine and gambling was widespread, deeply rooted. It was one of the key pastimes, one of the key forms of entertainment, one of the key forms of when men particularly used to gather together. This was one of the key ways to pass their time as entertainment, as an activity together. So we have to understand that this was a very deeply rooted thing. If you look at Jahili poetry, many poets mention wine, they talk about wine, they talk about gambling. You know, their form of gambling was a specific form, but it's still gambling. You will see many people, many of the poets describing wine, the drink, but also using wine as a metaphor for love and things like that. But it's very embedded, it's very deep-rooted in the society. They've grown up on it, their fathers drank, their grandfathers drank, they used to trade in wine, they used to bring it from Syria or Yemen or other places, they used to trade in it, it was a big trade, it was a big consumption item for the Jahili Arabs. In terms of their gambling, what they used to do is, one of the forms of gambling was that they would divide up a camel, right? And draw lots. They would assign certain portions of the camel and draw lots. And the loser would have to pay for most of the camel. And the others would eat from the camel. They'd cook it and eat. And they'd distribute as well, but they would eat from it. But the loser ends up paying for it. So that was the gamble. Or something similar of that nature. And they would sit there, they would get the camel slaughtered, skinned, and they would cook it there. They would get someone to cook it, they would sit there, eat it, and drink. So this was gambling and wine together. This was a very prominent, very common thing amongst the Arabs. So much so, Qurtubi relates a following story. It is said that A'shi, the famous poet, decided to embrace Islam. This was at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. On his way to Medina, he met a couple of pagans, mushriks. They asked him about his intention. They said, like, where are you going? Why are you going to Medina? And then he said he was going to see Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He was going to see the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They said, don't go, he will make you pray. He will command you to pray. Don't go there. And he said, that doesn't matter. A man is obliged to worship God. Then they told him, he will ask you to spend money. He will command you to pay money for the poor, meaning you're going to lose money. He said, ordering good deeds of this kind is also an obligation. It's a duty. It's not a problem. Then they said, he prohibits adultery. The man replied, it's a vile act and an unreasonable thing anyway. So moreover, I'm an old man, I have no more need of this. Finally, they told him he prohibits wine. He prohibits wine. This had an effect on him. This last one, he could give up, he could pray, he could give in charity, he could give up adultery. But this one, it had an effect on him. He thought about it. He said, as for this, I don't think I can restrain myself. So he turned back saying, let me drink for another year and then I will go back and become Muslim, embrace Islam. But he did not reach home on his way back. It's reported he fell from his riding vehicle, mule, and he broke his neck and died. So this is just one example where wine drinking is so ingrained, so embedded within individuals, within their culture, that it was a very difficult thing. It's necessary to understand that, because sometimes we hear, oh, in the Qur'an, wine was prohibited in 3 stages. We don't understand how ingrained within their culture, within their habits, within their entertainment form, wine and drinking and gambling was embedded. It was very, very difficult for the Arabs to give this up. It wasn't any easy task. And when you see the hikmah in how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibits wine and the stages and what He says about it, then you will understand why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taking a different approach with this compared to, say, other things. You know, other things are made haram more or less instantly, one time. But with alcohol, and even gambling in 2 verses, but alcohol 3, some say at least 3 verses or 3 stages, you will then understand why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes this approach. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ فِيهِمَا إِثْمٌ كَبِيرٌ وَمَنَافِعُ لِلنَّاسِ وَإِثْمُهُمَا أَكْبَرُ مِنْ نَفْعِهِمَا. Say, in them is great sin, meaning in gambling and alcohol, in wine and gambling is great sin and some benefit for people, but their sin is greater than their benefit. Ithm is disobedience, it's sin. It's referring to actual act. So the actual act of drinking, the actual act of gambling is ithm, right? It's sinful. It's disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's also the opposite of obedience or doing good deeds. It's the opposite of a good action. Ithm is also the opposite of doing a good action. Naf' or manafi' is plural of manfa', or naf' is benefit, that which benefits you. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says both. There's a great ithm. It's not just any ithm. It's not just any sin. Kabir. It's huge. The sin of it, the harm of it is huge. And there is some benefits as well, without a doubt. What are these harms of alcohol and gambling? Wallahi, when you read this verse, when you read other verses to do with alcohol, when you reflect on it, the most clearest display or articulation of harm for us as Muslims would be simply just to look at the stats in our country today. Just do that. Just read up. I'll give you some statistics on the harms of alcohol. Just read up the harms of alcohol. That's enough to understand this verse. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say the ithm is greater than the benefit? The harm or the sin of it is greater than the benefit. Alcohol, let's take alcohol first. Alcohol costs, this is 15 years ago, figures from 15 years ago, 2007. The total social costs of alcohol to the UK was 55.1 billion, not million, 55.1 billion per year, total social costs. If you break it down, 22 billion cost to individual and households, including crime and violence, private health and care costs, lost income due to unemployment, etc., etc. Just 22 billion just on costing individuals and their homes and their families. You have 21 billion, or almost 22 billion, on human cost, the pain and grief associated with the illness, disability, and death due to alcoholism or due to drinking. 3.2 billion cost to public health and care services, the NHS. I think last time I read somewhere the figure was 1 in 3 of every accident and emergency admission on the weekend is related to alcohol. So 1/3 of all the people going into A&E on the weekend is due to alcohol-related violence or alcohol-related something. 5 billion cost to other public services such as social care, criminal justice, emergency services. 7.3 billion of costs to employers due to lost productivity, absenteeism and accidents at work. Then you have, in terms of alcohol-related crime and social disorder, just looking at that, it costs the UK taxpayers 11 billion per year. 11 billion pounds per year. This is 2011 prices. Every year, alcohol is associated with 1 million crimes in the UK. 1 million every year related to alcohol. They said in terms of violent offences, alcohol-related crime makes up to 39% of all violent crime in the UK. 39% of all violent crime, attacks, assaults, stabbings, whatever it is, at home, outside, almost 40%, 39%. Even higher in Scotland, 54%. There's also almost 2/3 or above 50% of domestic violence in the UK is also related to alcohol abuse by usually the partner who is abusing. Health impacts. According to the World Health Organization, the harmful use of alcohol results in 3.3 million deaths every year worldwide, representing almost 6% of all deaths. So every year, worldwide, 3.3 million people die due to alcohol-related causes. In the age group of 20 to 39, the young age group of 20 to 39, approximately 25% of the total deaths are alcohol attributable in the UK. The people who die between the ages of 20 to 39, 1 in 4, 1/4 of all those deaths related to alcohol. Similar with gambling, it's much less in terms of numbers and social impact because there are some health impacts, but it's not as much as alcohol. Gambling, you have extra cost, 1.2 billion a year to the government due to gambling, up to maximum of. And it's estimated around 350,000 people are suffering from a gambling addiction. 350,000 people suffering from a gambling addiction. What happens when somebody's addicted to gambling or even alcohol? But let's say gambling. That means that person's income for sure is going to be wasted on gambling. That person is probably going to turn to crime, probably going to be depressed, probably going to deprive his or her family, etc. And the stats go on. Every year, people waste 7 billion pounds on gambling in this country. 7 billion on gambling. Most people, as you know, 99.9% people don't win in gambling. It's only a few who win. And even then, later on, if they continue playing, they usually lose it. So all of that money is wasted. People lose their jobs, families, homes due to gambling. People commit crimes to acquire the money to gamble. This is overall in society. Overall in society. But what about the harms of alcohol and gambling in our communities? Are we immune from it? Are we protected from it? No. We should be. We have a deen. By the way, it's not proven that alcohol specifically has ever been prohibited by any Sharia before Islam. It's not proven. Some people say, yeah, there's ikhtilaf. According to those religions themselves, they say wine wasn't prohibited. According to Muslim scholarship, some people say it may have been prohibited. Some people say it wasn't prohibited, but it was prohibited to get drunk, etc., etc. But Islam, the Sharia of Islam, is the first time that alcohol becomes prohibited clearly, at least proven, at least what we know of. Because the other texts, we don't have the authentic original versions of those texts. We don't know exactly what was said there. But at least with proof, in our Sharia, alcohol, wine, is clearly prohibited, clearly haram. But even then, this community should have been protected from it. If we are the first community in where the Sharia of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, alcohol has been made clearly haram, we should be the first community protected from this problem. But we're not. We know why we're not. And we see this. If you work in the drug treatment field, as I did, if you work in youth services, if you work in the community, social services, even if you work in schools, you will know the impact of gambling, drinking, and we can include drugs in this. Gambling, drinking, and drugs. This is a huge problem in our communities, especially in the last 20 years, 25 years, is a steady increase amongst our youth. It's everywhere. You'll see in the papers, so-and-so killed his wife because of gambling addiction. So-and-so put a knife to his mother's throat because of drug addiction. And many of the violence in town hamlets is very proven. It's very well known by the authorities, by the police, by the stats. It's very well known that the violence in town hamlets, the number one factor, number one cause behind it is the drugs distribution market, drug dealing, groups of drug dealers, etc. So this drugs is related very strongly with the violence in our communities. And I'm talking about Muslim communities here, talking about local Muslim communities. Our communities, our youth, our adults are involved in this kind of social ills, unfortunately. We are not immune, but we can only blame ourselves. Yes, there is a societal pressure. We all can understand that. There is a big pressure from wider community who the law is very confusing because drugs are haram. Under UK law, drugs are haram. Alcohol is halal. Alcohol is fine. So the culture encourages drinking, sees it as fine. There's no problem associated with it. So young people are under tremendous pressure. And then you have poverty, disadvantage, etc., etc. You combine all these factors, it's very difficult for some of our youth to stay away from all this. But also we have to take part of the blame as well. If we are opening, if we own 10,000 or 12,000 businesses that serve alcohol, if we are actually owning the off-licenses that serve alcohol, Muslims, restaurants, off-licenses, shisha places and other places, we are bringing this onto our own community. Yes, no matter how much you give your son or daughter tarbiyah and protect them, of course there will always be a chance that they can get influence in any society. But also we have, as a community, as parents, we have that responsibility. Are we giving them the tarbiyah? Are we involved in the haram ourselves? That's the question we need to look at. What are we doing as a community? Where are our income sources? Are we involved in the spread, in the distribution, in the consumption, in the business of selling alcohol? These are the questions we need to ask ourselves. We need to see what that is in the light of Quranic guidance. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say about this? Until we do this properly, this will only increase in our communities. This will only increase in our communities. Young people, young people will only emulate if they see adults openly selling and also sometimes drinking. If they know adults are also selling drugs, it's very well known. Lots of different groups of people are selling drugs on different estates. It's very well known. Young people only emulate that when they have no other options. When they're dropped out of school, when they're coming from broken homes, when the parents aren't there, the father's absent. Who will they turn to? They will turn to these role models. So there's a lot of work we need to do and be aware of. It's a growing problem in our communities, and we need to deal with it. We need to raise awareness, educate our youth, etc. Then we look at the wisdom of gradually making something as deep-rooted as wine and gambling prohibited. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows obviously how embedded wine, drinking and gambling is at that time in that society. See how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says He doesn't make it haram. In this verse, alcohol is not made haram. Gambling in this verse is not made haram yet. Allah is simply saying the sin of it, the harm of it, is greater than its benefit. According to most scholars, still it doesn't mean it's haram yet at that time. So what is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doing here? First of all, He's preparing psychologically, He's preparing the Muslim community of the time to understand that there is a harm there is something to reflect on, something to think about. Because at the time, the Muslims of the time who used to gamble, who used to drink, they would have thought that the majority of it is beneficial and there's some harm. Their understanding of gambling and alcohol or drinking wine would have been the opposite. They would have seen, oh, gambling, there's benefit, I can make quick money. Secondly, when they used to gamble, a portion of it, they used to also give it to the poor in charity. So they used to think there's benefit. I'm employing someone to slaughter the camel, we're having a laugh, friends, we're making money, some of us also donating in charity, the poor benefit. What's the harm? Alcohol, again, it's enjoyable, it's a pastime, it's entertainment. What is the harm? It strengthens you, etc., etc. What is the harm? So they would have been seeing it as more beneficial, less harm. So the first step Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does is switch that around. He makes it very clear, no, it's the other way around. There's more harm to it, there's more sin, there's more negative consequences to alcohol and gambling than the benefit. The benefit is less. What are the benefits? There are some benefits to any, in this world, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't make anything usually 100% purely beneficial with no harm. And He didn't make anything 100% harmful, purely harmful with no benefit. So same with gambling, same with alcohol. It's mainly harmful, it's mainly negative, but there's some benefit in it. How do people benefit? Those who sell wine, they benefit, they make money, right? Those who make money out of gambling, those who make money out of entertainment, etc. Even today, there is an economic gain for people. There may be even small health benefits according to some researchers, very minor, but there could be. So the benefit is there. Allah is acknowledging that there is some benefit, but the harm is much more. The harm is greater. The harm is much greater. Is kabir, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. So He's preparing the believers psychologically to alert them for the future ruling to come. Secondly, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is doing is one of the features of the final Sharia for mankind is often that Allah tells us the cause, the reason behind the ruling. Allah informs us. Why? Because this is the final Sharia. After the Prophet ﷺ passed away, there's no new laws to be revealed to the Muslims. It's just whatever was revealed in the Qur'an through the Sunnah, that's it, that's the law. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows this is the final Sharia. It will last to the end of time. And Muslims will come across, after centuries, new issues. They will come across new things which they have to give a ruling on with the Sharia that was revealed. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as is a common feature of this Sharia, He's giving them the reason why this will become haram. He's telling them the wisdom or the cause or the reason behind why something will become haram. And the reason cited here is the ithm of it, is the sin of it, meaning the harm of it, the negative consequences of it, right? What it leads to. And in the other verses, which later prohibit wine and gambling, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly says those harms very clearly, that it causes enmity between you. It stops you from remembering Allah, stops you from salah. It allows shaitan to come in and cause enmity and hatred between you. So there's so many negative things. But here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is getting the believers used to hearing about, preparing them about rulings, but giving them the cause behind it, the reason why it's haram. Allah is telling us this. Why? Once we understand the principle, we can then apply it to other things that will come in the future. If we know why is something haram, what is the illah behind it, what is the legal cause behind it, what is the reason behind it, then we can apply that principle to any new cases that are similar. So for example, there was no cocaine, crack, heroin at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. These drugs were not known. Or all these other new drugs that come out every year. How will the Muslims give a hukum on it? How will they give a ruling on it? Because they know the illah, they know the legal cause behind alcohol, which they've identified, not just from this verse. Overall, they've identified it as the intoxicating nature of alcohol. Thereafter, the harm it leads to. But the intoxicating nature of alcohol, that is the problem. All the harms come because it intoxicates. Umar radiallahu anh, why did he want a ruling on it? Because even when this verse was revealed, there were two incidences. One, this verse was revealed, then Umar radiallahu anh, he asked for even a clearer ruling. He thought this was okay, good, but he wants even a clearer ruling. He wants Allah to say, make it haram. Why? He's witnessing things. He's seeing the harm caused by intoxication. He's heard of the incident where a group of Sahabi were drinking and a fight broke out amongst the Sahabi, because that time drinking was not haram. A fight broke out, people injured each other. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the next verse in Surah An-Nisa, يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تقربوا الصلاة وأنتم سكارى. O you who believe, do not come near prayer whilst you are intoxicated. So even with this verse, Umar radiallahu anhu, he wasn't fully satisfied. The ruling still hasn't come clearly. Why? Because he saw one of the imams in prayer came, he was drunk. He had drink before he came to prayer. And then he saw that he was mixing up his recitation. So he asked Allah for a clearer ruling, and this is the ruling that came. Do not go to prayer whilst you are intoxicated. After that, still he's not satisfied. Because why? He can see the harms. He understood the harms of alcohol. So the scholars, and then finally, with Umar radiallahu anhu's wish, the final verse is revealed in Surah Al-Ma'idah, which makes it very clear, alcohol becomes haram. But Umar radiallahu anhu, he understood the harm of alcohol and gambling. He understood the consequences of the intoxicating nature of alcohol. So this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes clear in His rulings. He gives us the reason so we can use, or scholars can use their intellect and make Sharia dynamic. Because a common question people ask when you present Islam to non-Muslims, or when you're doing a training with non-Muslims, if you talk about Islam, one of the questions comes up, how can your legal system be relevant for today? It was 14 centuries ago. Very old, it's outdated, it's historic, it's pre-modernity. How can it be relevant for today? This is how it's relevant. One of the ways. Of course, there's so many other answers. First of all, it's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who's perfect in knowledge. He knows all human behavior. He knows what's good and bad for human beings. He knows what's beneficial, what's harmful for human beings. So His laws will be perfect for all times. But even within that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the principles, the legal reasons behind most rulings are given. Why? So scholars can then take those principles, take those ilal, and apply it to new cases. In that way, Sharia remains ever dynamic. It can absorb any new cases, something that didn't happen at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, something that didn't happen at the time of revelation. Sharia can absorb new cases through qiyas, legal analogy. When the scholars discover the legal cause behind the ruling, they can then apply that to new cases. And it gives you an understanding and appreciation of why we have to do certain things. It's a motivation. If you understand something, you're more likely to understand the importance of it. You're more likely to agree with the ruling. Here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving them, one, the preparation, psychologically. Two, He's explaining the principle behind it, the harm behind it. Why? It'd be easier on the Sahaba, it'll be easier on the companions, on the believers to accept the final ruling when it's prohibited, when it becomes haram. As you know, the famous narration, Aisha radiallahu anha, she's reported to have said that if alcohol was made haram in one go, no one would have accepted it. This is a big statement, subhanallah. The Sahaba, they were the most obedient. They were the foremost, the forerunners of accepting any ruling from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whatever the Prophet said, they were so obedient. They were so motivated. They were so eager to obey the commands of Allah and the Prophet ﷺ. One of the Sahaba, when he was coming to the mosque, Jum'ah time or something, one of the salah, he was outside, he heard the Prophet ﷺ say, sit. Prophet ﷺ is inside, he's talking to the people inside the masjid. But from outside that Sahabi, he heard the Prophet ﷺ say, sit down. He sat down in the middle of the road outside the masjid. Eagerness to hear and obey the command of the Prophet ﷺ. These people were willing to sacrifice everything. But even to this community, Aisha radiallahu anha, she says, had wine been prohibited in one go, people wouldn't have accepted. It would have been so difficult for people to accept. So look at the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in giving His ahkam, in giving His rulings. And this is not His ruling for His benefit. Whose benefit is it for? It's for our benefit. Who is it harming? Alcohol, gambling. Who is it harming? It's harming us. So look at the mercy, the care and kindness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the generosity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala towards the believers in explaining the wisdom behind the ruling, or the cause or the reasoning behind the ruling, and then introducing it in stages, 1, 2, 3rd stage. This is the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ مَاذَا يُنْفِقُونَ قُلِ الْعَفْوُ كَذَلِكَ يُبَيِّنُ اللَّهُ لَكُمُ الْآيَاتِ لَعَلَّكُمْ تَتَفَكَّرُونَ. They ask you, what should they spend? Say the excess, beyond needs. Thus Allah makes clear to you the verses of Revelation that you might give thought. So they also ask, and how is this connected? وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ. One of the connection could also be because, okay, if they stop or if they recognize, even this verse isn't making it haram, but many of the Sahabis stopped drinking and stopped involving themselves with gambling after this verse because they understood the indication in it. So one of the connection could be, okay, if they stop this, then where should they spend their charity money? Or if there's ithm in gambling, because part of that money used to also be given to the poor. So that could be one of the connection, or it could be totally independent question. So the question is, what should they spend? What should the believers spend? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says they should spend the surplus amount. Meaning, Islam is so balanced. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so merciful that you don't have to give in charity that which will cause you hardship. The golden rule is, as an explanation of this ayah, is that every Muslim has first obligations on his dependents. On his dependents. So if you have children, if you have a wife, if you have parents old who are not earning, or if you have other family members who are poor, these are your first obligations. You don't give in charity while denying these people. So your first obligation is your own self, your family, your close relatives who have a haqq on you if they're not earning. If you fulfill all of that and you meet your needs, then the surplus, whatever's remaining, that is encouraged to give in charity. Not give everything and then your dependents are suffering. Not give everything and then you're suffering. So here, this is the balance of Islam, that what we should be spending in charity is after what we spend on our dependents, on people who have a right over us. This is very important. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, in this way He makes clear to you the signs, the verses of the Qur'an, so that you may reflect, so that you may think, so that you may understand, so that you can think, what is beneficial for me, my family, for the Muslim community. Look at the ayahs that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent, guiding us in every aspect. He's always preventing me from falling into harm. He's always preventing me from falling into negative consequences for my dunya and akhirah. He's always encouraging me, ordering me, commanding me, motivating me to do things which are good, to do things which are beneficial for me, my family, my community, in the dunya and in the akhirah. So we'll stop here today, inshallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq to understand His verses and to understand the reasons and the wisdoms behind His rulings, and to understand those prohibitions which are critical, and for us to be able to embody those rulings, follow those commands, but also to raise awareness in our communities. We have a duty, each Muslim here, alhamdulillah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you and reward you for attending any study circle, any tafsir, any class. Seeking knowledge is first step. Second step is we have to go and convey that to others. We have to do our work in the community. We're not here just as individuals. We have a duty. Convey from me even one verse, the Prophet ﷺ said. We have a duty to enjoin the good, forbid the evil, forbid the wrong. We have a duty to educate, to raise awareness. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the tawfiq to understand this, embody ourselves, and take this back to our families, relatives, communities, and raise awareness, inshaAllah. Jazakumullah khairan.